I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
And we are two nerds who are here to make Shakespeare easier to understand.
In this podcast, we will explore as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which the plays were written, and how his plays are viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as theater makers, how his plays can be responsibly performed today, all while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to Bardolatry.
So, Shakespeare, anyone?
Hi, listeners. Want to support Shakespeare, anyone? Visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Courtney.
How's it going?
It's going okay. I've got some hay fever. My allergies are really acting up. So I may sound a little stuffed up today. How are you doing?
I'm so sorry that you're feeling all stuffed up. It's such an inconvenience for, again, whenever we have these kinds of like sinus problems or voice problems, it's a horrible thing to experience when you are going to be releasing something that is audio.
I guess I'm just glad that you edit all the episodes so I don't have to listen back to like the noise of my Kleenex.
That's all right. Well, we thank you so much, listeners, for bearing with us. It is a very polleny time in Sacramento for Elise.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I actually just returned from a trip to the desert, like the Southern California desert, so I'm feeling relaxed, rejuvenated. I saw a bunch of lizards and weird rocks and got some time in the sun, so now I'm ready to like sit down, buckle in, and talk about Henry V and foreigners.
Yeah, and we've already done some episodes on England, specifically through the lens of the early colonial actions that England was taking during Shakespeare's time. So today we're going to be looking specifically at foreigners that come from other European countries.
I do want to plug the post-colonial series that we have. It's our annual National Day of Mourning / Thanksgiving holiday where we excavate proto-colonialism, as scholar Jyotsna Singh calls it, looked in Shakespeare's time and influenced Shakespeare's plays. So yeah, if you want to learn more about colonialism in terms of like English people and the other, people of color, that will be in our episode description.
But first things first, a little bit of housekeeping. This episode is going out on Shakespeare's birthday.
Happy birthday, Shakespeare.
Looking pretty good for 462.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone go ahead and pour out some ale and a pickled thing, because apparently it's apocryphal rumor that Shakespeare liked pickled things.
Oh.
Can't confirm, just heard it.
Pickle girl, okay. And to celebrate, we have a very exciting announcement. We have merchandise. We have merch. You can now show off your love of Shakespeare Anyone, the podcast, and Shakespeare in general by going to www.shakespeareanyone.com/shop. We have personally designed everything in this store, and we are so looking forward to designing more collections in the future. Plus, every purchase plants a tree and removes 5 plastic water bottles from the ocean.
Yeah, in addition to supporting the podcast, in addition to supporting Elise and myself, you're also putting money into the planet during Earth Month.
Yep. And of course, you will be able to show off your love of the podcast and maybe run into other Shakespeare Anyone nerds out in the wild. And as we have mentioned in previous episodes, we also have our teacher survey. We are looking to hear from teachers who are working in the secondary education space and who teach Shakespeare or want to teach Shakespeare or maybe used to teach Shakespeare. We want to hear more about what you are expected to teach and what sort of plays you've been teaching. So if you'd like to give us your feedback, head to www.shakespeareanyone.com/teacher survey, all one word, to share your thoughts with us as we look to think about how we can help educators who are teaching Shakespeare in the classroom. You also may have noticed that we now have ads. This is a milestone for a lot of podcasters. Our Patreon patrons now have exclusive access to ad-free episodes, and our ads run at the beginning and end of each episode. Speaking of Patreon, if you would like to support the pod, it is our preferred way. Patreon patrons get all sorts of access to exclusive content, in addition to ad-free episodes of the podcast. You can also buy us a coffee or shop our bookshop.org storefront. As a bookshop.org partner, when you shop our bookshop.org storefront, you are able to support the podcast and local independent bookstores all at the same time. Links to all of those are available at shakespeareanyone.com/support.
If you would like to bump up our place on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you can make sure to give us a 5-star rating, leave us a review. Any and all support that you can give the podcast, we greatly, greatly appreciate. And thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So, Elise, now that we have covered housekeeping, let's get to what the listeners want. And that is
an actual episode.
Yes. I mean, and to be fair, I also want this too. I love having these conversations with you. And I can't believe that this is our final discussion episode in our Henry V series.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think it caught us a little bit by surprise, to be honest.
Yes. Listeners, just a little bit of behind the scenes information. We are recording this episode on Monday, April 21st. I'm going to be editing this on Tuesday, April 22nd, and it's coming out on Wednesday, April 23rd. So this really is a quick turnaround that we somehow weren't able to get ahead of. Yeah.
Now we're here. Let's dive in.
Yes.
So as we talked about at the top of the episode, we have talked about early modern England and the role it played in global colonialism, and you'll talk a little bit more about early modern England's, and especially Elizabeth's, campaigns in colonizing Ireland later in the episode.
Mm-hmm.
My reading specifically looked at the experience of immigrants and foreigners from other European nations. My reading comes from Nigel Goose's Immigrants in Tudor and Early Stuart England, specifically the chapters Xenophobia in Elizabethan and Early Stuart England, an epithet too far, and Immigrants and English Economic Development in the 16th and early 17th centuries. So I'm going to talk about what were English attitudes towards European immigrants during the Tudor and Early Stuart time periods, so the generations just before Shakespeare and, of course, covering Shakespeare's life. According to Goose, historians actually disagree about English attitudes towards foreigners, with some, such as Laura Hunt Youngblood and Lian Liu, describing the English as generally xenophobic, citing threats of physical abuse and parliamentary legislation that was designed to restrict economic and political rights of immigrants and their children. However, other authorities have some reservations about categorizing specifically Londoners as xenophobic, citing a lack of evidence of actual violence perpetrated against immigrants versus clear evidence of peaceful coexistence, attributing tension between non-immigrant and immigrant craftsmen as the result of immigrants not conforming to rules that all artisans were expected to conform to, and therefore suggesting that the word xenophobia is perhaps too strong for attitudes that are represented in records that we have, such as ones from the Weavers' Company, and that are represented in Thomas Decker's play, The Shoemaker's Holiday.
I also read a little bit about The Shoemaker's Holiday.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So Goose argues that, additionally, there's been a use and reuse of comments by foreign visitors and diplomats that are taken out of context and without additional critique addressing the commenters' potential anti-English sentiment, and therefore that does not create an accurate picture of the experience of all immigrants in England. Quote, "In many cases, the visits of foreign travelers and diplomats were very brief indeed, and such passing acquaintance could hardly be sufficient fully to lay bare the English character. This is particularly true of the Venetian diplomats that are so freely quoted, such as Andrea Trevisano, who stayed in London for a few months in 1496-7, describing the English as great lovers of themselves and of everything belonging to them. They think there are no other men than themselves, and no other world but England. And whenever they see a handsome foreigner, they say, 'He looks like an Englishman,' and that it is a great pity that he should not be an Englishman. They have an antipathy to foreigners and imagine that they never come into their island but to make themselves masters of it and to usurp their goods." Unquote. So
yeah, that's harsh.
Goose says that, taking especially these aristocratic diplomats who have their own prejudices against England, potentially as like the experience of all immigrants, is potentially problematic in historiography.
Yeah, and I imagine too that like as we have discussed on this podcast, England is not a monolith.
Yes.
Certain, groups are not monoliths. And so and the things that we are reading are primarily coming from aristocrats, nobles. They're laws that are written by the queen or the government. So that's hardly adequate enough information to describe how, like, even just commoners felt about immigrants and vice versa.
Right. Goose notes that these types of sources are also subject to plagiarism, which we know was not as criminal as it is today. It wasn't seen as like a bad thing to do. It was seen as like actually kind of the right thing to do, using like it was how you used your sources. So it was therefore more common. So there are other Venetian diplomatic reports that follow Trevisano that are described as being, quote, highly formulaic and extremely repetitive, unquote. This repetition is seen in things like agricultural handbooks, county and national descriptions, travel literature, and ethnological descriptions. As an example, there's an unpublished Italian diplomatic report from like 1540 that makes some really bizarre claims about England, like that the weather is most temperate without any bad air any time of the year. Yeah, your face.
Yeah. I'm like,
also England, famous for its temperate weather. And that, quote, everywhere many men reach the age of 110 and others 120 years, unquote. And that the sheep, quote, do not drink other than dew, unquote.
Oh, fancy.
And then 5 years later, there's another report by a French historian that repeats the 120-year lifespan claim and the sheep drinking only dew claim. So, like, clearly they likely had access to this Italian diplomatic report. So there's like an extreme example of like some of the things that are being said about England during this time. These reports are not without their own prejudices, right?
Right.
So then, more relevant to specifically English opinions of foreigners, there's a 1598 report by a gentleman named Paul Hentzner of Brandenburg, who echoes the Trevisano report from a century earlier, basically saying like the same quote of like, oh, it's a pity that English people, if they see a handsome foreigner, say, well, it's a pity he's not an Englishman. And then a Swiss physician writing in 1599 also echoes that same remark. So these things kind of seem to be passed along as English stereotypes, not necessarily true. Furthermore, other European nations have early modern stereotypes for each other, right? So the English make fun of the French for being foppish, or they say that like Irish people, which you'll get to in a minute, the Irish are wild, Germans are drunk.
Sorry, just that makes me think of Hamlet and his musings about how the Danish are viewed partying.
Right. So, yeah, so this like idea of like the English as untrusting, prideful, and envious, it might be kind of more like on par with these stereotypes rather than a true they are xenophobic, like broad brush. Additionally, in early modern England, it was actually widely believed that all humans descended from a common ancestor, and suggesting otherwise was heresy. And they explained racial and cultural diversity through the biblical stories of two peoplings of the earth from the book of Genesis, the migration of nations to different geographical destinations, and then subsequent degeneration. As another addition, contemporary writers were not always consistent in their descriptions and appraisals of England's reception of immigrants or foreigners, so Goose further argues that it's really possible to distort their views by pulling out a few select quotes. Here's an example. There's a 1561 example from Levinus Lemminus about their experience in England. Quote, every gentleman and other worthy person showed unto me, being a stranger born and one that never had been there before, all points of most friendly courtesy, and taking me first by the hand, lovingly embraced and bade me right heartily welcome. Therefore, frankly, to utter what I think of the incredible courtesy and friendliness in speech and affability used in this famous realm, I must confess it doth surmount and carry away the prick and price of all others, unquote. So there are foreigners who are welcomed, and specifically we see during this time period, as you said, early modern England, not a monolith, and their attitudes towards foreigners and immigrants were also diverse and often ambivalent, specifically in regards to Dutch and French immigrants, who made up the majority of immigrants to England during the Tudor and early Stuart periods. There was a big wave of immigration in the mid-1500s that sort of petered out towards the mid-1600s. So that's where we'll take a look, and thinking about French foreigners specifically as we look at how the French are portrayed in Henry V. So with the Dutch, there is considerable admiration for the Dutch Republic, as they are mostly Protestant, very commercially successful, and were England's allies against Spain, as well as England's trade partners. So there's a lot of writing that is positive about Dutch immigrants. France is a little bit more mixed reviews from 17th century English travelers. There are criticisms that address the poverty of French peasants, the absolutist system of government, the corruption of the French judicial system, and the quote-unquote superstitions of its Catholic religion. However, English writers also wrote with admiration of the French populousness, the fertile agriculture, the beautiful countryside, the architecture, the towns and cities, the literature and intellectual life, and the language and the way that people sort of comported themselves. And as early as 1598, we have writings admiring French fashion and dancing. So there is mixed feelings about the country of France.
Yeah, it sounds like the politics, the government system, and the religion is kind of more of a no-no, but the art and culture is very popular.
Yes. Also, a lot of the French immigrants that we see coming to England during this time are Protestant refugees. So they are French Huguenots.
Yeah.
There's also a positive opinion of them for that reason in England.
Yeah,
right?
Makes sense.
Additionally, by the late 1600s, we start to see the practice of a grand tour, which is a period of European travel as the sort of capstone experience of a gentleman's education, was well established. And it becomes more expected of a gentleman that a young gentleman will do this in the 18th century, and we continue to see it into the 19th century. The roots of this practice can be traced back to the time of Henry VIII and was emphasized during the reign of Elizabeth and continued to just grow in popularity during the Tudor and early Stuart period. And this grand tour was young gentlemen. It would have included, quote, Paris and the French court, the south of France, the cities of northern Italy, from there to Florence, Rome, and Naples, returning to England via Germany and the Low Countries, unquote. So there's a European tourism that England is interested in, especially men of means. So especially in the more affluent ranks and higher ranks of society, there's more welcoming than we often hear about for European foreigners. There's also a willingness to go and travel to these other countries. So while we find that variety of attitudes towards foreigners, and especially a sort of ambivalence within the upper ranks of society, when we look at what the English did instead of what they said or wrote, we can see that more violent opposition to foreigners is more common in the lower ranks of society. According to Goose, quote, whenever either visiting or resident foreigners either felt or were actually threatened with physical harm, the blame was almost invariably laid squarely upon the shoulders of the common sort, the apprentices, the mob, the meaner sort of people, or some similar descriptor. Examples of foreign complaint that draw this distinction are numerous, though one must again be aware of the possibility of plagiarism, unquote. The most renowned example predates the influx of immigrants during the third quarter of the 1500s, and that is a day known as Evil May Day, in which a mob of apprentices attacked immigrants in 1517. This event entered into popular mythology and was later exaggerated in ballads to be like gallons of blood in the streets. But, quote, the contemporary chronicler Edward Hall gave a more realistic assessment, which reveals that about 1,000 people were involved in the disturbance. An unknown number of immigrants' houses were attacked, but no life was taken, and just 13 rioters, plus a broker named John Lincoln, who had been a prime instigator of the Troubles, were convicted of treason and executed, unquote. There is no further disturbances of the peace on this scale related to anti-immigrant sentiment for the remainder of the 16th and 17th centuries. However, after the mid-century migration, 500 to 600 men did complain to the mayor and aldermen of London and threatened to kill immigrants because immigrants might bring plague or dearth. The mayor and aldermen did a survey of immigrants and instituted precautionary and restrictive orders, which seems to have prevented further violence. In 1563, the Crown did proclaim that it was legal to harass French subjects at English ports as a response to a breakdown of the alliance between England and French Huguenots, which led to a number of Frenchmen being imprisoned in London, and it would take 2 more proclamations before harassment of French people died down. Threats of violence are also noted in 1567, 1586 through 7, 1593, and 1595. However, on none of those occasions did violent disturbance actually materialize. It was just, we just know of threats, and we don't have any record of actual violence taking place. However, the most serious threat to foreign communities in early modern London came in a series of events in 1593. The central component was not the threat of violence, even though there was a piece of libel published that year that read, quote, "Be it known to all Flemings and Frenchmen that it is best for them to depart out of this realm of England between this and the 9th of July next. If not, then to take that which follows, for there shall be many a sore stripe. Apprentices will rise to the number of 2,336, and all apprentices and journeymen will down with the Flemings and strangers," unquote. And the Dutch courtyard in London was similarly graffitied with a similar sentiment. Authorities arrested several young men who were then put in the stocks, carted, and whipped as an example to other would-be troublemakers. And Goose notes that this sort of tense popular climate around immigration may have, quote, "moved Edmund Tilney to insist that the authors of the play, The Book of Sir Thomas More, which, inter alia, dealt with the events of evil May Day, wholly leave out any depiction of the riot itself, and satisfy themselves with just a short report, and not otherwise at your own perils," unquote.
I read that play for school, and I was thinking, I was racking my brain, what is the name of that play? What is the name of the playwright?
You're like, Evil May Day.
Yeah. I don't think they call it by that, but it's definitely like a report about foreigners and what the common subjects want to do to basically kick them out, punish them. They have a lot of, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, so this threat of violence happens. It's dealt with by authorities, but it's not the biggest thing in 1593 that's facing immigrant communities. 1593 sees a congruence of resentment across social hierarchies, resentment towards foreign communities in England. We see the threat of a rising of the apprentices, a series of petitions from tradesmen complaining about the trades and occupations practiced by foreigners, complaints from English shopkeepers against foreigners keeping shops and selling retail. And this one specifically would cause a long and heated debate in Parliament over a bill introduced by the City of London. This bill, trying to prevent foreigners from keeping shops and selling retail, had featured such anti-immigrant debate points were brought up for this bill, including, quote, "the undercutting of English prices and conversely the tendency of strangers' retailing activities to raise prices, loss of employment among the English, export of profits overseas, giving to strangers the privilege of retailing not granted to native inhabitants, secretion of wealth to avoid subsidies, the refusal to converse or intermarry with the English, and the refusal to also buy from any but a fellow foreigner, their inordinate wealth, and again, conversely, the inordinate number of them living by begging," unquote. So people who were anti-immigrant, just to summarize that again, argued that the French and Dutch immigrants, their business was undercutting English business, but also making prices too high. They were taking English jobs, and they were not assimilating with the English. They were too wealthy, but also too many of them were beggars. So
some things haven't changed.
The anti-immigrant playbook has not changed in 400 years.
Ding, ding, ding. Yeah.
There were also strong voices defending immigrants, such as Sir John Woley, who argued, quote, "This bill should be ill for London, for the riches and renown of the city cometh by entertaining of strangers and giving liberty unto them," unquote. Others argued that English merchants were the ones who were exporting English money, and the religious and moral example of the stranger community was also invoked. This bill was carried in the House of Commons by 162 votes to 82, so it passed through the House of Commons, but it was thrown out by the House of Lords 4 days later. Further threats of violence in London did not materialize, and the dates of all threats are significant because they coincide with other economic disruption, such as dearth, plague, or both. We see anti-immigrant sentiment decline further in the early 1600s because economic dislocation on the scale of the 1590s did not reoccur, and by the early 1600s, assimilation was taking place. And then King James I writes letters of patent in 1612 that emphasized the economic benefits that immigrants brought to the communities where they settled. For example, Dutch immigrants brought expertise in the manufacturing of new types of cloth, transforming local textile industries within a generation. By the early 17th century, new draperies accounted for 23% of customs paid on English cloth exports, And by 1640, new draperies accounted for 42%. So almost doubling the English exports of drapery, which challenged English woolen cloth for supremacy in England's export trade. The innovations that they brought increased the diversity of fabrics that England was able to export, and this allowed England to break into new markets in Spain, Africa, and the Mediterranean. And locally, this revived textile industries that were stagnating or dying away. In one example, the village of Colchester in Essex, the local English inhabitants wrote in defense of their Dutch neighbors and extolled the benefits that they brought to the town in terms of the employment that they created. Employment in textiles in Colchester had dropped from 30% to 18% of local employable men prior to the Dutch immigration in the mid-1500s. And then by the late 1500s and early 1600s, it bounced back to 37% of employable local men were now employed in the textile industry in Colchester. Other innovations in textiles included establishment of thread making at Maidstone, which provided a stimulus to flax growing in the Mid-Kent area, lace making, ribbon making, and stocking knitting at Norwich, which spread to Wales, and 10 additional English countries by the start of the 1600s, and silk twisting in London, where there was an influx of Dutch and French immigrants. Other industries stimulated by the influx of immigrants include, quote, various leather trades, brewing, glassmaking, pottery, furniture making, hat making, starching, soap making, alum and copperas making, cutlery making, tapestry making, pin making, watch and clock making, gold and silversmithing, vinegar making, and the distilling of aqua vitae and other strong waters, unquote. Immigrants also worked as merchants, which was more common in London than in the provincial towns, so they were still prominent there. There's also a lack of evidence of violent opposition in the countryside, talking communities outside of London. However, there were still conflicts over economic and social matters. Immigrants in provincial communities were also accused of the same things that we see in that London bill. So immigrants in provincial communities were, just like their counterparts in London, accused of taking away jobs from Englishmen, sending money outside of England, employing only each other, being secretive. And the most frequent complaints were that immigrants traded by retail when they should have been restricted to wholesale, and that they practiced occupations that were not allowed by their original letters of patent that governed their settlement in England.
Oh, like their visa or whatever wasn't approved for this thing, and they switched careers and they switched this, that, and the other.
Yeah, they're doing things that the original
don't permit them to do.
Yes, that they're permitted to do by law. But to keep things in perspective, English newcomers to provincial communities, especially poor newcomers, were also met with similar complaints. So these objections to economic activities were likely not so much about the origin of the community partaking in the economic activity, but more about trying to target abuse of privileges granted to trades and craftsmen, rather than target the privileges themselves for a specific community. So again, this is a time we've talked about where the guilds and the trades are controlled, and there are like rules, and they, work together to set prices. And so it's that somebody's coming in and disrupting and not following the rules that everyone else has agreed to.
Either way, mercantilism by Englishmen was also destroying the fabric of the guilds. So it was happening regardless. I mean, yeah. I don't know the specifics, but
yeah, I think it's the anxieties of the changes that mercantilism was bringing is being played out in microcosm in these communities against anyone who's doing something different than like the trades and craftsmen we're used to doing.
Right.
And it's important to note that like in difficult economic times, immigrant presence did represent competition for employment and markets in these provincial areas. However, Goose notes that, quote, under all but exceptional circumstances, town corporations acted in harmony with the Crown and Privy Council to uphold the rights and privileges of the foreign communities, while those communities, in turn, largely through their churches, sought to regulate their members' behavior to the satisfaction of their hosts, unquote. So, to summarize, there is one major uprising of young, disenfranchised men against immigrants.
You don't say. You don't say.
I don't know, apprentices, like, they're not established in their careers.
Uh-huh.
And then there are threats of violence, and through the government, in one instance, an attempt to restrict the foreign communities. And here and there pops up some tension, but it seems to be more based in trying to get the foreign communities to assimilate to how things are done rather than being like xenophobic violence, because the same sort of reaction is given to English people of English nationality who are not from originally from the
it's
areas.
Just being an outsider.
Being an outsider, yeah. All in all, there's a lot of contradictions and attitudes to foreigners in early modern England, and a lot of ambivalence. To link this to Henry V, to consider that there is a noticeable influx of French people into England, this subplot of Henry V in this very pro-English play, there's this subplot of, of joining France with England.
Right.
But specifically showing Catherine as sympathetic and including her as a love interest, so that the only French representation isn't the Dauphin and his court.
Yeah.
In the same way that, like, the end of Macbeth is like, Thanes, henceforth be earls. Like, I'm Englishizing you. I do wonder if Kate's inclusion as a sort of like, and now we are going to be not just like ruled over by the same king, but like we're going to become one literally in marriage, it feels like similar.
Merging cultures, merging people. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like that might also be in here a little bit.
Then perhaps just England ruling over France.
Yeah. But speaking of England ruling over places.
Wow.
Do you want to talk to me about
England ruling over places that don't want it to rule over them? And unfortunately, there was a mission by England, by Elizabeth specifically, to colonize Ireland. And my reading is a chapter from Christopher Hyley's Shakespeare, Spencer, and the Crisis in Ireland. And it's a chapter called If the Cause Be Not Good, Henry V and Essex's Irish Campaign. And we've talked a little bit about Essex before. Essex was a court favorite of Elizabeth's until he fell out of favor. So specifically, that's Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. And this reading is a very broad look at a particular period of the 9 Years' War. And it's a particular snapshot at Essex's Irish campaign and how that campaign informed Henry V. And there are some ways in which the play could reinforce some of the colonization and some of the war effort, but then also ways that maybe there's like counter discourse from Shakespeare about the state's massive campaign for colonization. So there's going to be a lot of moving parts, but yeah, let me get into it. So I'm going to kind of plop us down in the middle. And I will say as a note, I am not an expert on the history of Ireland and England. If you listen to the podcast, you know that Elise and I are anti-colonial, anti-imperial, and so I have a lot of opinions about what England did, but I am not an expert. So my contributions to this episode are really contained to this article that I read. So I'm not going to get to everything. The both of us really want to explore Shakespeare and Ireland in greater depth at a later time. But right now, I'm going to be really focusing in on this particular chapter. So that's just my note. The Earl of Essex was first appointed to the long vacant viceregency on January 13th, 1599, following an English defeat at the Battle of Yellowford in August of 1598, as well as an October Rebellion. So prior to Essex's involvement in the Irish campaign, there was another lord who was in that commanding position. In 1598, the Irish were battling the English settlers. And as I said, there was an English defeat in August of 1598, and then also a very successful rebellion that happened in October. And as a result of this rebellion, a lot of English settlers, including Robert Spencer, they fled. Like their homes were burned. They fled this part of colonized Ireland and headed back to England. And so Essex was in command of the Irish campaign in the last few years of the war. And the 9 Years' War took place from May of 1593 until March 30th, 1603. And the 9 Years' War is sometimes called Tyrone's Rebellion. And so this particular conflict is what most people call it, was a conflict in Ireland between a confederacy of Irish clans and the English-led government. And so the war was primarily a response to the ongoing Tudor conquest of Ireland. And so by the time Essex is appointed a position, he was appointed the title of Lieutenant General and General of Ireland. And he had a huge force because, like, after the defeat in August, as well as the rebellion, Elizabeth really ramped up the resources for Essex's army. So he had a force of 16,000 foot soldiers and 1,300 horses, with reinforcements of 3,000 men to be sent out every 2 months. So this was a really like massive campaign with a lot of manpower as well as like financial backing from Elizabeth and the English government. This appointment of Essex, as well as the resources he was provided, they were seen by many of the New English community as the Queen's license of an aggressive approach to the Irish quote-unquote problem. So the Irish rebels were fighting back, they were succeeding in fighting back, and Elizabeth and England had to ramp up and get more aggressive in order to keep their settlements, as well as likely settle much more of Ireland. And English author and soldier Thomas Churchyard wrote in The Fortunate Farewell to the Most Forward and Noble Earl of Essex, as well as other texts, a lot of commemorations for Essex's departure, and he forecasted his victory over, quote, Tyronish Irish rebels, unquote. And Tyrone was both the Irish kingdom and later earldom of Gaelic Ireland, and the leader of the Irish rebels was also Tyrone. So if you hear me say Tyrone, it's both the kingdom as well as like the leader of that part of Gaelic Ireland. Okay, so that's the context coming into Essex and his involvement in the Irish campaign. And now I want to tie Essex's campaign into Henry V, and I'm going to kind of like weave in and out these pieces as I go from like the top of Essex's involvement to his return. And Henry V was written around 1599. We don't have a performance date, but we know it was published in 1600, and it was around the same time as Julius Caesar. Shakespeare's play was written and performed and published around the same time or during the same time as Essex's involvement in the Irish campaign. And so that final chorus in Henry V was written while Essex was absent in Ireland, and there was no certainty about the outcome of the campaign. And the folio, scholars believe, derives much of its energy and appeal from the acute public sensitivity to the fortunes of Essex in Ireland. Quote, a fantasy of a successful Irish campaign, a displaced imaginary resolution of one of the state's most intractable problems, unquote. However, Hiley posits that Shakespeare's Henry V produces a skeptical counter-discourse about English expansionism in Ireland. So there's this question of like nationalism, but Hiley explores this kind of counter-discourse that may exist in Henry V. So that's what I'm going to focus on. But before we follow Essex to Ireland, I want to set the scene with the political anxieties that England was experiencing right up to this point. And you mentioned it a little bit, Elise, in one of our episodes about the Spanish Armada. Yeah. So at the end of the 16th century, England was really nervous about Spanish aggression. And so in the spring and early summer of 1599, the country was scrambling to repulse a feared Spanish invasion. They were fearing that the Spanish would invade much like the Armada in 1588. So Hiley is posing that in Henry V, while the English were very nervous about invasions and defeat, Henry is the invader who is going to win France for England. So this is like an inversion of the actual anxieties that the English were experiencing. But if we go back 6 months to the Irish campaign, so I'm kind of hopping around a little. If we go back 6 months to the Irish campaign, 6 months prior to this is when Essex departed for Ireland. He departed in March of 1599, and the Armada fears that I was just talking about were the summer of 1599.
Oh, okay.
In March of 1599,
Essex goes to
Ireland. England goes to Ireland.
Yeah, and Elizabeth invests a bunch of extra money into Ireland.
Yes.
Into invading Ireland.
Yes. So they're trying to ward off Spain while going and invading and colonizing Ireland.
Yes. So when Essex departed for Ireland in March of 1599, his dispatch was a piece of theater. It was very ceremonial. It was a big leave taking from London that was recorded by John Stow in his Annal with, quote, a great train of noble men and gentlemen on horseback before him,
To accompany him on his journey, his coaches followed, unquote. So Essex's dispatch to Ireland was a very good PR move that was intended to impress Elizabeth, the public, and also solidify him as a hero. During Essex's departure, he actually did something that he was not supposed to do. While he was away in Ireland, he bestowed knighthoods upon many of his officers in Ireland, which is an act that was expressly forbidden by the Queen.
Ooh.
Yeah. And this was a way of creating what Mervyn James calls a distinctive social subculture that is loyal to Essex versus, the monarch. And Henry V's chorus similarly treats the campaign as the business of his leader and his entourage. So all of Henry's followers are, quote, following the mirror of all Christian kings with winged heels as English Mercuries, unquote. And so Henry heading off to France is similarly like Essex heading off to Ireland. And it's very ceremonious, and there are followers, he has support, and it's a very popular campaign. But Stowe's 1615 edition of his Essex's departure portrays Essex as humble in plain attire and full of broad popular support. So by the time Annals is republished, the way that Essex is portrayed has changed from this like grand ceremony to a more like humble kind of departure to Ireland. And so that is Essex departing to Ireland. Once he's there, once he's in command of the Irish campaign, the size of Essex's armies caused extreme hardship, particularly an inadequate food supply. And the conditions of extreme hardship in Ireland are reiterated in Henry V as the English army is starving and sick in the field. And this is mentioned a couple of times, like after the siege of Harfleur, English soldiers are, quote, sick and famished in their march, unquote, and, quote, people are with sickness much enfeebled, unquote. And on the eve of Agincourt, the French are reassured that the English, quote, are shroudly out of beef, unquote. Henry's troops are also experiencing hunger and hardship.
Okay.
Yeah. However, hunger in Henry V is viewed as a necessary condition for victory, not an impediment to hunger, where like Essex's soldiers experienced a lot of hardship, and it wasn't a like necessary condition for victory because they were not victorious. But for Henry's troops, it was part of like them overcoming hunger and becoming victorious. And the hardship of hunger plays a role in both Essex's campaign as well as Henry's campaign. And so I first want to talk about Essex, and then go into Henry. So Essex was granted personal control of the victualling operation, and that was the body that oversaw providing personnel with food and drink. And Henry takes on the role of feeder to his men as well. Henry says, quote, nor care I who doth feed upon my cost, unquote, and he personally cuts back on his food intake. So both Essex and Henry are concerned about the food and supplying enough food to their men. Henry also appropriates the role of army victualler, or sutler is another term for it, but it's that position that provides food and drink to army personnel. And this was actually a position that Pistol had originally claimed, but he used it for a self-serving cause versus Henry, who wanted to actually nourish his troops. And similarly to Shakespeare and Henry criticizing the self-serving sutler, Essex also complained that many of the government-appointed victualers/sutlers were untrustworthy, and he wanted offending suppliers punished with extreme severity, since, quote, there is not a more dangerous enemy than famine, unquote. However, ironically, the fact that the Henry's troops are able to overcome hunger, and it's seen as something that is a necessary condition for their victory, conjures up more the Irish rebels' success at adapting their appetites to conditions of scarcity, because famine was used as a weapon by the English on the Irish. And the chorus includes this as part of the king's formidable arsenal. And so highly posits that this might be a fictional hybrid of the English cum Irish. The conditions of the Irish were being used in Henry V for the English, Henry's English, co-opting an Irishness rather than doing a one-to-one of Essex's soldiers and Henry's soldiers. Henry's troops are co-opting the conditions and the spirit of the Irish rather than Essex's English soldiers.
It's like saying, especially thinking to the anxieties that you're talking about, it's saying no, we should be brave. And if we're thinking about like trying to speak to the English people and quell the anxieties with this story of Henry V as like invader, it's like, no, be more like these Irish that we're fighting and like be brave and like we're English and we can be.
Yeah. And then dually, there's this Englishing of the French. And you were mentioning like the kind of attitudes towards the French. And Shakespeare uses this kind of Englishing of the French who are seen as nervous and defensive, like the English during the Armada. And then the French also refer to the English as, quote, a barbarous people, unquote, which is a discourse that the English used against the Irish.
Yeah, my reading was like, there's barely like the use of barbarous when it's written. It's really rare that that word is used and it's not about the Irish in early modern English writing. Pretty much synonymous.
Yeah. And so the whole French perspective on the English in the play Henry V repeats an English stance of cultural superiority toward the Irish. The French characters articulate a kind of eugenic fantasy. They're very concerned about the fusion of the civil and the barbarous people. And John Donne, who was friends with Essex's secretary, Sir Henry Wotton, warned to beware, quote, the Irish negligence and lethargies. And so, like, the English and Essex's people were concerned about the Irish in this kind of way that the Dauphin has a contempt for, quote, bastard Normans, Norman bastards, who mixed with the Saxons and created the English. So there's this concern about hybridity or this kind of contamination of Englishness.
So it's so the French in a way are they're representing the more xenophobic attitudes towards others, and then the English are this sort of in the play are sort of this, I think you used the term hybrid of multiple cultures, specifically how the Irish were behaving towards the English. And there's also like the intentional blending of the English and French, like I talked about earlier. And we have, the military officers who are Scottish, Welsh, and Irish and English, all working together in Henry's army.
Yeah. And that's a perfect way to get into the captains.
Oh, great.
Yeah, the captains. So there are these issues in the play with hybridity and assimilation that are explored in the scene before Harfleur with the four captains. Again, that's England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So the Irish captain, Macmorris, critics have noticed, has an unstable ethnic and national identity. And Macmorris reflects in the scene before Harfleur on his nation. He says, quote, of my nation, what is my nation? I hate saying that, but that's the way that Shakespeare wrote the, Irish accent. Ish a villain and a bastard and a knave and a rascal. What is my nation? Who talks of my nation? Unquote. And so Macmorris's nation is actually descended from the Anglo-Norman conquerors of Ireland who, since the 12th century, changed their name's prefix of Fitz to the Gaelic Mac. And this group in Ireland was seen by the New English as more Gaelic than English, and by the Gaels as more English than Gaelic.
Oh, okay.
And so Macmorris's appearance interrogates, quote, an assimilationist mythology, unquote, a phrase Robert Stillman uses to characterize, quote, the united action of Arthur, the emblem of English civility, and the salvage man, unquote, in the Faerie Queene. And so this basically constitutes a, quote, mythic image of the salvageability of the old English settlers of Ireland and their potential aid to imperial British sovereignty, unquote.
So it's like, we've done it before, we can do it again.
Yes.
Specifically because Macmorris is a descendant of former invaders of Ireland.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah. The four captains in Henry V depict a confrontation between an Irishman, a Scot, and a Welshman, and their interactions rework the potential collusion of Celtic groups hostile to English rule in Ireland into an internal competition against reluctant allies over how best to advance the cause of an English king. So all of these Celtic people, like their concern is more so how to best advance the cause of an English king. It washes away fears of a pan-Celtic alliance at a time when the English would be very concerned about the Irish, the Welsh, and the Scottish aligning themselves against England and England invasion of Ireland.
Whoa.
So they're not just these random, officers. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the whole thought we had behind this episode was like, these can't be just in here to be in here.
Yeah.
There's a purpose to them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And during the time of Essex's campaign, the union of rebel Irish and Highland Scots was a troubling alliance for the expedition. During the campaign, Scottish mercenaries, Scottish nobilities, and allegedly, this is a rumor, allegedly King James VI were offering material and moral support to Tyrone's mercenaries, so the Irish rebels, against Essex's campaign for Elizabeth.
Ooh.
And so the four captains alleviate English anxieties through loyalty and alliance to Henry's campaign.
Right. Yeah.
So now to talk a little bit more about how the Irish influence Henry. Henry actually piggybacks off of Macmorris's violent threat of scalping at Harfleur, and in ways the English become, quote, a barbarous people, unquote, like the Irish kerns that were feared in John Derrick's The Image of Ireland, or the Munster rebels of The Supplication and the Blood of the English from 1598. And Hiley argues that Shakespeare makes the English threaten a kind of violence the Irish were accused of by English settlers. There were all these English writers who were writing about horrible things that the Irish were allegedly doing, like displacing people from their homes, killing babies. And so it was this fear-mongering that wasn't happening, but the English were demonizing and creating a barbarous Irish. And interestingly enough, Henry co-ops violence that the Irish were accused of by English writers. Hiley writes that perhaps this co-opting of the Irish violence by Henry in the scene at Harfleur, where he's mentioning displacing people and killing people, perhaps Shakespeare is writing this as a reminder that the English moral high ground was untenable, as the English were likely to either merge with the Irish, bring barbarism to Ireland, or cleanse Ireland. So there wasn't really any positive, like this campaign that Essex was on for Elizabeth was not really an English moral high ground.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Is this making sense?
I feel like there's like a lot in like all the things that Shakespeare could be saying in this one play, which is fascinating. Much like sort of like the invasion of France in Henry V, Henry goes there because he has a claim to France, right? And so English people and French people are going to be ruled by the same king and be part of the same nation. And I think what I'm hearing a lot from your research is like a lot of that is coded messages about this invasion of Ireland, of like, if we are successful in this, Irish people are going to be English people, and maybe people who we are currently fighting against will be our allies, and we have a right to do this. And, you know, like I said about like Macbeth being like, we are Englishizing Scotland, this is like through France Englishizing allegory for the invasion of Ireland.
Yeah, I think that there's, at least from what I captured from my reading, is there's a lot of like counter discourse through this allegory of like putting side by side Ireland and Henry V's army, because they're more similar than Essex's army and Henry.
Yes.
At least at the time when Shakespeare was writing, because again, reminder everyone, there was no conclusion. The 9 Years' War was ongoing. And so there was no conclusion to the invasion and the campaigns and the colonization. But in what was happening at the time, Shakespeare might have been placing more of the qualities of the Irish rebels onto Henry V's army compared to the historical Essex, who was in Ireland fighting for Elizabeth. And that was the campaign that everyone is waiting to see, like, what's going to happen when Essex gets back? What's the resolution to this? Yeah. And in the midst of this, there's all the kind of hybridity and the characters of different nationalities. And he thinks that Macmorris is partially assimilated to British rule. He is following Henry V. He is a loyal subject in the military, but he still has these like hot-headed Irish qualities. And then on the flip side, one of the other prominent captains is Fluellen, who is the fully assimilated Celt that we read about in works like Churchyard's Worthiness of Wales, which is a discursive work about the anxieties about the loyalties of Celtic subjects to the Queen. So while there's all of this concern that like the Celtic people will make alliances against the English, we have Fluellen, who is a character who is fully assimilated, is not a threat to Henry V's campaign, and the victory for England.
Yeah.
A colonial subject who has internalized English values and subordinated his own provincial loyalties to the service of the English nation states. And Fluellen actually is an anglicized form of Llewellyn.
Yes.
And the parts of him that are Welsh are kind of like minimalized. Like the biggest thing about him that's Welsh is the symbol of the leek.
The leek.
Yeah. And the Welsh meaning of the leek is likely Shakespeare's own devising, in spite of alternative meanings that exist that are like actually oppositional and anti-English. So Shakespeare may have devised something that changes the symbol of Welsh identity, anglicizing that symbol of the leek as well, because Shakespeare traces the leek's significance back to Edward III's victory at the Battle of Crecy versus the different narrative that the leek was the special food of David, patron saint of Wales. So the depiction of Fluellen is very anglicized, very assimilated compared to the partially assimilated Macmorris.
Okay. And the like not assimilated Jamy.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not assimilated
Not
Jamy. Yet. And Hailey didn't really talk much about Jamy, but I think that's mostly because the Scots weren't really a part of the campaign in Ireland.
Yeah, they'll come later when James unites the two countries. Yeah.
Exactly. And then on top of that, Shakespeare potentially questions the rank and file soldiers and their views on going to war to colonize. This is done through Williams, because Williams has this deeply held concern lest, quote, the cause be not good, unquote, about Henry's cause going to France. Williams points outside of the play to a subculture of dissent and resistance in early modern Britain to the imperatives of war-making and national expansion. So while there's this like money and resources being funneled into the Irish campaign, there was some dissent that existed amongst like rank and file soldiers as well as commoners. And so Hailey suggests that there was domestic unease at the latest offensive in Ireland due to the fact that the government thought it necessary to defend by proclamation the appointment of Essex at the head of a royal army. And the court issued an order in the summer of 1599, quote, forbidding anyone on pain of death to write or speak of Irish affairs. What is brought by the post is known only to the council, unquote.
Interesting.
But even though the government censored people's ability to speak out about the Irish affairs, if you will, that didn't prevent commoners from attending a play like Henry V and recognizing the dramatization of a warmongering state. And other plays did that too, like The Shoemaker's Holiday and Sir John Oldcastle, which criticized war, the treatment of soldiers, warmongering. However, opposition to the government's policies in Ireland became more vocal, particularly as literacy rates rose and marginal and religious groups gained more access to the printing press.
Okay.
This was especially prominent when Oliver Cromwell led an English army to conquer Ireland in 1649. In this second campaign, 50 years after Essex, soldiers and civilians protested this due to unpaid services, a demand for domestic concerns to be addressed first, as well as it just being morally wrong. In Shakespeare's time, there were influences like Erasmus, who opposed war between nations, and there were Christians such as Matthew Hutton, the Archbishop of York, who expressed concerns over Ireland with the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1600. And then some also depicted the quote-unquote conflict as a religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. So there was sympathy for the Irish by Catholics as well as recusant Catholics in England. And then some were also opposed to the war in Ireland due to the economic domestic backing for the war. The war was paid for with government money and by loans and subsidies. So in spite of this massive government support, it was not necessarily popular. But also, Essex's campaign was depicted as being very popular. But we also really don't know what people generally thought, specifically because the government censored people's ability to speak out, and the campaign was also unpopular for soldiers. By 1600, conscripted soldiers were reported by their superiors as rioting at muster points and ports of embarkation, or they also sought passage back to England. And there was also a high rate among the Welsh who resisted conscription or deserted their post as they were ideologically opposed to colonization. So in spite of this, think back to the beginning of this where Essex had this huge ceremonious goodbye, this ceremonious leave to Ireland for his campaign. by this point, like a year later, it was just not a popular war for the people involved.
Right.
And by 1600, Essex was decrying his troops in a letter to the Privy Council due to their baseness and cowardice. And he urged that, quote, "These base clowns must be taught to fight again, else with Her Majesty's honor never be recovered, nor our nation valued, nor this kingdom reduced," unquote. So Essex, by this point, he was like reporting that he had to fight base Irish rebels with his own base English men. So very low morale over in Ireland at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, Elizabeth was harshly criticizing Essex's conduct, and Essex may have feared betrayal by the Queen and Privy Council. There was a lot of uncertainty about that relationship, which makes sense because John Harrington, our bestie with the modern flush toilets,
our recurring character.
Yeah, he just finds his way into Shakespeare anyone lore. But he recounted a potentially apocryphal, this might be apocryphal, but an argument between Essex and the Queen on the eve of Essex's departure in 1599. And this argument was seen as a turning point in the relationship between Essex and Elizabeth. But by 1600, this heroic campaign to Ireland to squash the rebels for Elizabeth was not working out for Essex, and his like heroic victory was being demoralized, basically. And so this like ongoing campaign is potentially being nodded to in Henry V, when the chorus in Act 5 compares the return of Henry to the return of Essex from Ireland. The chorus says, quote, "As by a lower but by loving likelihood, were now the general of our gracious empress, as in good time he may, from Ireland coming, bringing rebellion broached on his sword," unquote. The chorus is referencing the general of Elizabeth returning from Ireland, and the question is Essex returning as a conqueror of the Irish rebellion, or does this mean, like, is it questioning if he's going to bring a rebellion to London? And the chorus questions, like, how many people are going to welcome Essex?
Will it be like this return that Henry's getting? Yeah.
And a fun fact, Essex returned to London a week after Julius Caesar was performed at the Globe on September 21st, 1600. That was 1 week before Essex's unexpected return from Ireland, and highly notes that, like, Julius Caesar is about foreign victory and dominance at home through, like, a kingship. And so in some ways it could be a cautionary precedent as England awaits Essex and his ambitions. But I don't know. But then Shakespeare also, like, has a scene in there to purposely be like, don't actually take what we're saying seriously.
Right.
We're the poet. Don't take the poet seriously, in order to discredit the role of Shakespeare and his collaborators as, like, harming public confidence or criticizing Essex during this very uncertain political time. But a week after Julius Caesar, Essex concluded his campaign in Ireland. And do you think, Elise, that it was as successful as Henry V's campaign in France?
No, I do not.
No. 400-year-old spoiler alert for those who are not aware.
We've also talked about, like, sort of the aftermath of this in our Macbeth episodes, and talked about the Essex Rebellion that comes later when he rebels against Elizabeth.
Yes.
So I don't think it was successful because he's going to need reasons to be mad at Elizabeth.
So let me take you from point A to point B.
Great.
So Essex negotiated with Tyrone, again, the lord in Ireland, the Irish rebel. And so he negotiated with Tyrone in person, and then he arrived unannounced in England, quote, upon Michaelmas Eve, about 10 o'clock in the morning, unquote, to meet Elizabeth in her bedchamber.
I'm sorry, what?
I know.
Like, honey, I'm home.
Exactly. I'm like, what was that relationship before the strain? It could justify why he was trying to go to Ireland, be a hero, get back in the good graces with...
We know he was a favorite, so it's not like out of his, like, realm of possibility to be close enough to her to have access to her bedchamber, which was her private quarters, not her bedroom. Yeah. But he returns unannounced, and Elizabeth is not happy. He's put on house arrest, but he was not punished for his unauthorized negotiations with Tyrone. He was placed on house arrest for his earlier rejection of her instructions, his spending and creation of knighthoods, and returning without leave. He's in trouble because he did a bunch of things without consulting her first.
Yes.
Undermined her authority in a bunch of situations.
Yes. And technically he undermined her with the negotiation, but
Yeah.
she actually like endorsed the treaty, and she uses as an opportunity to try to turn Tyrone into a good subject, quote unquote good subject. So like it was all this other stuff.
And there's a huge difference between stepping into the role of the sovereign for the sovereign's subjects than like being an ambassador who works out a treaty.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was unauthorized, but we had an episode where we talked about like the role of ambassadors, and that would be appropriate
Yes.
because you were trusted. You
in our historical figures episode from this
Yes.
series, yeah.
Yes, you're trusted, and that is your responsibility to go and negotiate on behalf of the sovereign. So Elizabeth viewed this treaty as a way to turn Tyrone into a good subject. However, Essex was now an arch traitor, and he was tried by his peers, and he was stripped of his titles and offices. He had a massive loss of income, influence, and honor. And so he returned to England without this heroic welcome, without the heroic image. But even though he was stripped of all of his privileges, he was cleared of disloyalty. Essex, he feared that this consequence was a design of his enemies, so particularly Cecil, Cobham, and Raleigh. And so on February 8th, 1601, Essex led his followers to the court in a bid to remove his rivals and to gain control of the Queen. And that is the Essex Rebellion. This was his attempt to remove his rivals and then get in good graces with the Queen and to win over the Queen. I'm not going to go into the details of the Essex Rebellion. We've talked about it briefly. Maybe we'll write a mini episode about the details of this particular instance. But Elizabeth was not happy. And on February 25th, 1601, Essex was beheaded in the confines of the Tower of London. Rumors swirled that Essex was being secret friends with Tyrone, again, the Irish rebel leader.
Mm-hmm.
Rumors also spread that Essex was a clandestine Catholic and in solidarity with Ireland. Robert Cecil claimed Essex and Tyrone had conspired to usurp the Queen so that Essex could be the King of England and Tyrone of Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
So in this way, Essex is being Irished, and then an Irishman is becoming like noble in the English sense. And that's the end of Essex, really. I'll do a quick conclusion to the 9 Years' War. After Essex was beheaded, his position was appointed to Lord Mountjoy, who we've also talked about with the Gunpowder Plot. Lord Mountjoy led the English to victory against Tyrone in 1601, and then Ireland was subdued in 1603. That ended the 9 Years' War, and that was 6 days after the Queen had died. So James ascended to the throne, and then he attempted to unify England and Scotland, and then by proxy Ireland. And James welcomed Tyrone to court as an Earl of Ireland, what you mentioned before about switching up these names. But then Tyrone fled to the continent in 1607, and Scottish subjects settled in Ireland. And then the rest is unfortunate colonizing history. But James had a vision of an England with Englishness, Scottishness, and Irishness blended into a single homogenous identity, and that never came to fruition, and conflict continued due to colonization, and it still permeates to this day.
Yeah.
That was my reading. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
No, this was fascinating. We talk about it a lot of how Shakespeare, we've talked about before, about like how Shakespeare is speaking both to current events and like writing things that are approved by the government. He can't speak truth to power outright. And there's a lot of beliefs out there that this is a propaganda piece in favor of the Essex Rebellion. And you kind of broke apart like all the different ways that it is speaking to the English populace about this effort by Essex's campaign in Ireland, and trying to like almost like get their support behind it, and also assuage their fears about being invaded by the Spanish Armada, and all of these contemporary political influences that are embedded in this story of this historical fiction of Henry V at Agincourt and invading France. The popular image of Henry V has persisted as Shakespeare's version of Henry V, which is in many ways invented by Shakespeare, weaving all of these different threads together.
Yeah. And also in some ways, like the contradictions of how Shakespeare uses different like political forces or nationalities or groups to tell his story, where in reality, the Irish rebels are much more like Henry and his troops, where they are seen as the underdogs and then they, come to victory. And of course, we do know in hindsight that that's not the reality for Ireland, unfortunately. But the different ways that like Shakespeare and this play are discussing nationality, discussing conquering, discussing warmongered society, like it's very fascinating to break those things apart and look at the historical context. And it doesn't always line up one to one. And it's a little bit messy in this piece, I feel like. I learned a lot. There was a lot of historical things I learned. And, the comparisons that Hailey makes don't necessarily make a complete package with a bow on top.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because maybe there is a part of Shakespeare that's very critical of this hyper warmongering campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, Shakespeare also has to inspire the public to support this campaign for Elizabeth, for England. But yeah, in conclusion, Essex's Irish campaign may have more influence on Henry V than I previously thought.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, if we're looking at a victory, Essex is a very terrible one-to-one. He doesn't do that in the end. And his campaign leads to his downfall.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting to me to think about the fact that this play was written at the same time that the campaign was going on.
Yeah.
And how did Shakespeare use these influences, these like geopolitical influences, and how do we read it today, especially knowing the history of England and Ireland?
I think that when we produce Shakespeare, I think one, understanding this piece of theater as a piece of historical fiction, and then also that just because Shakespeare writes somebody in an accent does not necessarily mean that he is mocking that nationality. He might just be trying to guide his actors into or represent the accent to indicate something to his actors.
Yeah, and just because Shakespeare wrote something a certain way doesn't mean that he represents all of English society's view.
That's also true.
Yeah.
So with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Courtney Smith.
And I'm Elise Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Never Ending Minute by Sounds Like Sander.
If you would like to support us, visit shakespeareanyone.com/support or check out the links in our episode description. You can also hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it. For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, or follow us on Instagram at shakespeareanyonepod.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here is a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Comedy of Errors, Act 4, Scene 4, spoken by Luciana. They are loose again.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call, I talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.